withdrawn, and I call Mark Durgan to ask the first question.
Ceist Iverhain, that's question number 1.
Minister.
I've been clear that online abuse and harassment is completely unacceptable. Everyone should be able to enjoy the positive benefits of online engagement without being subjected to vile, abusive and harmful content. Those who seek to harass, bully, intimidate or otherwise cause harm should be aware that such activity, whether perpetrated directly or online, may constitute a criminal offence. I would strongly encourage victims of such abuse to report all instances to the police. As the member will be aware, telecommunications, including internet services, are reserved matters. As such, the policy and legislation developed and led by the UK Government Department of Digital, Culture, Media and Sport, which is taking forward the Online Safety Bill. In that context, my department has not had or plans to have any direct engagement with social media organisations. I am nonetheless committed to doing whatever I can to enhance online safety, and my department is engaging with DCMS actively on the proposed bill. Mr Speaker, the Joint Committee tasked with scrutinising the bill published its report in December. While I may not agree with everything recommended by the Joint Committee, and I want to take time to consider that in more detail, I agree with the Committee Chair, Damian Collins MP, who in presenting the report stated that we need to call time on the Wild West online. My department is currently reviewing the recommendations in the Committee's report and also with the UK Government's response. I will then write to DCMS to set out my analysis of where the bill could be further strengthened. I have reflected my view to the UK Government now on a number of occasions that the proposed legislation does not go far enough, particularly in terms of online anonymity. I call on the UK Government to grasp this opportunity to ensure that social media firms and the big tech companies are appropriately held to account through regulation and enforcement.
Supplementary, Mark Durgan.
And I thank the Minister for her answer. Many in this chamber, including the Minister herself, will have been subjected to abuse far beyond what might be acceptable as political rough and tumble from cowardly, faceless bullies. And while it's never acceptable, I think it's fair to say that we reached a new or an all-time low with the recent targeting of Diane Dodds, and we offer her support. While acknowledging, Minister, that the telecommunications is a reserved matter, can the Minister outline what measures her department is specifically undertaking to support measures to enhance online safety?
Well, the member is, of course, I think, right to reflect the absolutely heinous abuse that Diane Dodds faced over the Christmas period. Having seen her original post, a rather pleasant post with her dogs and wishing people a happy new year, descend into some of the most callous and calculated abuse of an individual that I have seen in some time, I think filled most people with a degree of nausea and anger. I have been in touch with Diane since, just to extend my sympathies and my solidarity to her, and I also reported the incident to the PSNI, which is what I believe needs to happen in such cases. I have engaged with social media platforms where I have had the opportunity. For example, I engaged with Facebook as part of the online hate crime event, which was held in 2020, aimed at exploring hate crime in a digital context, and reflected my concerns directly to them about how social media platforms deal with online abuse. However, this is a much bigger issue than any department alone can address, and it does require, I believe, not just a UK-wide effort, but I believe a much wider effort, including our European partners, in terms of trying to challenge the abuse online and how social media platforms are managed. And I think that if we don't do that cooperation, it will be very difficult to move forward. I think it's fairly clear, Mr Speaker, and any of us who have had the misfortune to report abusive behaviour, whether directed at ourselves or others, will often be told by social media companies that it doesn't contravene their community standards. I think what's obvious from that is that self-regulation of online services has failed, and companies now, I think, must be held liable for the systems they have created. I believe fundamentally that people have a right to free speech, but that right to free speech comes with a responsibility to exercise it in an appropriate way, and no one has the right to a platform, and I think that needs to be taken into consideration by the companies.
I call Gemma Dolan.
And I thank the Minister for her answer. In light of the recent cruel murder of Aisling Murphy and the highlighting of misogynistic abuse that women particularly experience online, and the sick incident of cyberflashing that was happened during the online vigil last night, will the Minister join with me in condemning this abuse?
I absolutely will condemn the abuse, and I have to say that every time we see these things take place on social media, we assume that we have hit the rock bottom, and then along comes someone who can plumb new depths. I think the cyber flashing incident last night at an online vigil for Aisling was just the lowest of the low. That is an individual who I think the authorities need to take particular interest in and deal with robustly. There were children at that vigil who will have witnessed that incident. There were vulnerable women who have been previously abused who were at that vigil and will have been traumatised by that incident. And there will be many others who were absolutely horrified and also traumatised by what happened last night. It calls into question, Mr. Speaker, what goes through some people's minds in terms of how they actually operate. But it is interesting that so often, whatever is going through their minds, what we end up experiencing is misogyny, sexism and hate directed towards women.
Thank you. I call John Blair.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I start with associating myself with comments made by the original questioner, Mark Durkan, and the Minister herself in relation to the vile online abuse towards Diane Dodds and those mourning Aisling Murphy. Mr. Speaker, can I ask the Minister if she agrees that an interagency approach on this matter of online abuse is vital, and that people right across public service, but in particular those involved in education, youth services, local councils and PCSPs, have a very important role to play in engagement with the Department and the police, and of course online service providers also?
I think it is the only way forward, Mr. Speaker. There are a number of elements to this. I think, first of all, there is the issue as to how we help people to protect themselves from online abuse and to deal with that. And too often we focus solely on that element. But there is also how we deal with online abuse perpetrators. And I think that unless people are made amenable to the courts and before the law, we will not see a change in direction. And I think thirdly, it is about those who platform that abuse. If this abuse was being published in a newspaper, if it was being published in a magazine, the publisher would be held accountable. I see no difference between that and Facebook and Twitter, particularly given the sophistication of their algorithms. The fact that they know the age profile of the people they're dealing with and target ads at them based on things that they've shown previous interest in, for example, shows the complexity of the algorithms they have. The idea that they haven't the capability to actually sift out much of this abuse before it ever appears on their platform, to me, is just inconceivable, and I think more needs to be done across the board in order to protect everyone from online abuse.
Moving on, I call Steve Egan.
Question number 2, please.
Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I will answer questions 2 and 4 together. In doing so, I want to begin by paying tribute to the staff of the Northern Ireland Prison Service. They have shown determination, courage and resilience as key workers during the pandemic. Like every other frontline organisation, the Prison Service has seen the impact of COVID-19 and the Omicron variant upon staff availability. In December 2021, 90 Prison Service members tested positive for, and at one stage 14.6% of operational staff were absent due to COVID-19. However, that position has significantly improved during January, and last week less than 5% of staff were absent for COVID-19 related reasons. Since the beginning of the pandemic, the Prison Service have had thorough and comprehensive arrangements in place to monitor the impact of COVID-19 and respond appropriately. Northern Ireland Prison Service headquarters and the Governor of each prison establishment has been reviewing daily the availability of staff, and governors and their teams have been required to dynamically adjust the regime that can be delivered for people in our care, focusing on safe, decent and secure custody. This has resulted in the imposition of some restrictions on the prison population, particularly in evenings and at weekends. These have been kept to an absolute minimum. Prison Service has continued to focus on ensuring that healthy regimes can be offered on landings and the prisoners do not spend lengthy periods locked in their cells. The provision of virtual visits has also been a priority. To deliver those priorities means redeploying staff on a daily basis, and I'm grateful to staff for the flexibility they have demonstrated in what are very challenging circumstances. Northern Ireland Prison Services Executive Forum, the meeting where NIP's senior management team, including governors, discussed COVID-19 contingency arrangements, has met most recently on Friday the 7th of January to discuss the challenges presented by and the response to the Omicron variant. Throughout the pandemic, the Prison Service has been guided in its approach by advice from the Public Health Agency and the decisions taken by Executive for the community. Northern Ireland Prison Service stand ready to begin relaxing the measures introduced in response to Omicron as soon as it is safe to do so. Since the beginning of December the 9th, individuals have, on committal to prison, Since the beginning of December, 9 individuals have, on committal to prison, tested positive for COVID-19. No prisoners in the general population have tested positive.
Supplementary, Steve Egan.
May I thank the Minister for a very comprehensive answer. In comparison with the Northern Ireland Prison Service, has the Minister been able to do a comparison with the impact of Omicron and indeed other forms of COVID along with the PSNI? And has there been any lessons identified about how, bearing in mind we're probably going to have to deal with future pandemics, how we can support these key staff? And are there any other further lessons we could also pass on maybe to the probation service as well?
I think there have been pressures right across the justice system. Obviously, I'm not responsible for policing and in terms of the deployment of staff, but I'm aware that at the beginning of December, the Chief Constable moved to 12-hour shifts in order to ensure that any impact on policing would be minimal and that there would be full cover where required, and we discussed all of those issues at our regular meetings. Again, similarly with probation has been affected, of course, not just in terms of staffing, but also in terms of the logistics of being able to follow up with the people who are their clients in terms of their support, and they have had to find new ways of working, innovative and creative ways of doing so. Flexibility that staff across the justice system have shown in responding to this, I think, has been incredible. However, there are always lessons that can be learned. I think the key one is that we need to make sure that we keep Omicron and any variant of COVID out of our prisons in as far as is possible, because that will keep both our prison officers safe, but also those in the prison population.
I call John O'Dowd.
Can call you, and with the indulgence of the Speaker, on the subject of prisons, can I pay tribute to Father Michael Bingham from Portadown, who passed away over the weekend and whose funeral is occurring around now. He's not only pastored to the people of Drumcree Parish and Portadown, but also to many prisoners in jails and to their families. And it would be a huge loss to the wider community and those prisoners as well. But I thank the Minister for her answer thus far. Minister, what measures have been put in place to mitigate against the inability during the COVID crisis for face-to-face visits for prisoners? What support has been put in place for the prisoners and their families?
Well, there are a number of issues that we have dealt with in terms of, first of all, the ability to have virtual visits. Also, initially, prisoners were given additional time and access to phones so that they were able to phone more rapidly. And of course, in terms of our partner organisations, there has been intensive work done by those who support families outside of prison to ensure that the families' needs are addressed. We did reintroduce, as you know, face-to-face visiting. The uptake was relatively low in comparison to virtual visits, but we did introduce that for a period and unfortunately had to suspend it just before Christmas. But we hope to reintroduce face-to-face visiting again as soon as possible, because we recognise that good quality connections with families is part of the rehabilitation process for prisoners, but it's also crucially important to families as well, and it's something that we don't want to suspend for any longer than is absolutely necessary.
I call Mervyn Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Minister for the answers thus far, and also for the information that she has provided to the committee in relation to the measures that have to be taken in these circumstances, and commend the Prison Service for the way in which they have sought to deal with very challenging situation. But can the Minister give an assurance to the House that the budgetary pressure that is faced by the Prison Service will be addressed in a way that ensures that they have all the resources, not only in terms of this crisis, but dealing with the Prison Service in general, will be seriously looked at, because we all have concerns about the budget as it currently stands, particularly in relation to the Northern Ireland Prison Service?
Well, unfortunately, Mr Speaker, I cannot give an assurance that there will be no impact on the prison service or indeed on the PSNI from the current budget settlement that is out for consultation. It would be foolhardy of me to do so, because unless there is a significant step change in the draft budget, that will not be possible to secure. It is not just about a 2% cut, which many people may well say, well, any department should be able to absorb that. But it is about a 2% cut coming on top of a 9% cut since devolution, and on top of the additional responsibilities which have been placed on the department over the last 2 years through legislation which has gone through the committee and through the demands of the justice system in terms of more proactive engagement and more work to try to prevent offending. And so it would be impossible to say at this stage, because I have been very clear in saying that I believe that the budget as it stands will do direct harm to the justice system. So it is impossible for me to give the member that reassurance, but I can give him the reassurance that we will, of course, take our legal duty to ensure that prisons are safe, both for those who work in them and those who are residing in them, very seriously as we look at the budget. However, it is undoubtedly the case that in ensuring that the prisons are safe, it may nevertheless lead to a reduction in the rehabilitative work that up until now our prison officers have been engaged in. I think that would be a real shame.
Call Rachel Woods.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the Minister for her answers so far. Can I ask the Minister to clarify that prisoners can and do have access to books and magazines sent into them by family or friends, and that no change to this practice has been made in the last year to deal with the pandemic?
Prisoners do have access to books and to magazines that have been sent in. There have been restrictions in terms of the need to ensure that any packages that are sent into prisoners are properly appraised to ensure that they are not a source of transmission. But there has been no change to the overall policy in terms of what books and materials prisoners are able to access within the prison system. And there is an established route for people who wish to access books, whether that be through the library service within the prison, or whether it be through books, magazines and materials that are sent from home as part of their care packages, to be able to do that. And that system has not changed, though there may have been some delays in delivery.
I call Chris Little.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I ask the Justice Minister for an update on access to the Rehabilitation and Retraining Trust for former prison officers?
I thank the member for his question and for his general interest in this. I think in particular because of the challenging work environment past and present, I commissioned and published 2 reports in 2021 regarding support services for operational prison staff, including those who have left the service. It was recommended that the PRRT should provide a range of services to retired staff. This is open to former prison staff, irrespective of why they left the service. PRRT and NIPS have also met with relevant stakeholders in January to publicise the available services ahead of the launch on the 1st of February, and we continue to work towards the additional measures within that report to deal with those who are currently serving within the prison service.
I call Emma Sheeran.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Ceist for 3 Liddahall, question 3, please.
Jury trials deal with some of the most serious and sensitive cases in the justice system, and it is vitally important that justice is dealt with in a timely way, as this has an impact on the victims and witnesses of crime, as well as defendants. Jury service is a civic duty placed on members of society and is an essential part of the justice process. Some workers are excused or exempted from jury service because of the nature of their jobs. However, it is vitally important that juries continue to reflect the wider population. Even if it were appropriate, a change to the current exemption criteria would require an amendment to primary legislation, and clearly this is not a practical consideration at this stage. Jury officers and courts can be expected to sympathetically consider requests for excusal or deferral from key workers and others during the current pandemic. The number of people called for jury service this year was increased from approximately 34,700 to approximately 40,300 to deal with the anticipated greater number of applications for excusal or deferral. For those members of the public who must attend court, the Northern Ireland Courts and Tribunal Service, in consultation with the Public Health Agency, has implemented a range of measures designed to protect all court users and mitigate against the risk of COVID-19. The details of relevant COVID risk assessments and court user guides are made available to jurors in advance of attendance.
Supplementary, Emma Sheeran.
Gormagat. And thank to the Minister for her answer, and I take on board what the Minister is saying in terms of the importance of justice being delivered and the fact that primary legislation is required. But I would ask that, and notwithstanding that there is a backlog of court cases that need to be dealt with, we have got severe labour shortages, both due to the Omicron variant and also to complications with Brexit, that have seen several industries struggling. And would the Minister consider some sort of a workaround to see if there could be a balance to be struck to allow people to be exempt when they need to be for their work?
Well, excusal as of right for key workers would require an amendment to primary legislation, so it isn't a practicable consideration. However, as I have said, jury officers and courts can be expected to sympathetically consider requests for excusal or deferral from key workers during the current pandemic if people are able to provide them with evidence of particular pressures in their workplace. That is something on which I think they would look favourably.
Call Justin McNulty.
Thank the Minister for her answers thus far. Can the Minister confirm if the potential deficit in jury numbers due to the Omicron variant has the potential to further delay cases being heard?
At this point in time, as I indicated, what we're actually doing is calling additional jurors to come for jury service in the expectation that more will seek to have their jury service deferred, and so we have not had a problem in terms of being able to fill jury places in order for trials to commence. The member may be aware, of course, that the Office of the Lady Chief Justice indicated that it would be unwise over the last couple of weeks while the pandemic was at its peak for people to start trials which were likely to run to multiple defendants or indeed over multiple weeks or into months, as it may be difficult to be certain that none of the jurors and indeed none of the participants in the case more widely would be subject to COVID-19, which could disrupt the trial. So for that reason, shorter jury trials have been scheduled over the last number of weeks, and it is a matter always for the Office of the Lord Chief Justice to make those scheduling decisions, but it's clear from what she has said that that will be kept under review in order that there is no increased delay in terms of the court system. The biggest threat at the moment in terms of recovery of the court system is lack of investment in terms of next year's budget, because obviously recovery will not be completed in this year, and yet there is nothing in next year's draft budget that will allow for further recovery in courts.
I call Liz Kimmins.
Question number 5, please.
I previously advised ministers during Justice Questions on the 2nd of December that I had written to the Education Minister, Michelle McIlveen, in early July 2021, seeking a meeting to discuss what steps were being taken by her department to improve relationship and sexuality education, or RSE, provision. I issued 2 further reminders on the 11th of October and 11th of November, but still await a response. My request to meet with Minister McIlveen followed commitments made in March last year by her predecessor, Peter Weir MLA, that his department would lead cross-sectoral work to review RSE provision, including reviewing the minimum content order in relation to RSE. Following this commitment, my department organised a series of workshops to allow stakeholders to put their views directly to the Department of Education officials on how they believe RSE provision can be improved. Participants in those workshops also identified gaps in the current minimum content order and made suggestions about elements of RSE they felt should be made a mandatory part of the curriculum for all schools. While I wait the opportunity to meet with Minister McIlveen to discuss the progress made by her department since those workshops, my own department continues to work in other ways to increase awareness of serious sexual offences and to challenge rape myths. In the autumn, my department ran a public survey aimed at identifying the rape myths most prevalent in society. The survey closed on the 15th of November, with over 2,400 responses received. These results, along with ongoing workshops to gather the views of children and of people with learning disabilities, will inform the development of phased strategic communications to challenge the most commonly held rape myths. As part of this, my department has also supported the PSNI with their campaign entitled You Will Be Supported, which launched on the 16th of December. This campaign is particularly relevant to marginalised communities, but includes information for the whole community on subjects such as consent, the importance of reporting sexual crime, and where help and support can be found.
Supplementary, Liz Kimmins.
Gurra I thank the Minister for answering. It is very disappointing to hear that there has been no response to date, particularly something so important. We all know the importance of fully implementing the recommendations of the Gillen Review, and therefore would ask the Minister, would you agree that the recommendations on relationships and sexuality education carry particular significance in terms of preventing sexual abuse? And would you agree that it's important that engagement happens between yourself and the Education Minister in terms of how these will be implemented at the earliest possible time? Thank you.
I absolutely concur. I mean, this is a complex and a sensitive subject, and there are a wide range of strongly held political, religious and cultural views that need to be heard as part of this discussion. But it is a discussion that has to take place if we are to educate our young people in a way that is fact-based, that is non-judgmental, and that provides them and equips them for later life in terms of issues around consent, around rape, and around what a healthy relationship looks like. We would all wish that this is something we could simply leave to parents. Perhaps that's how people see this in many cases. But we know that not every child has an ideal role model to follow in terms of what a healthy relationship looks like. They may not get the right messages either from their peer group or from those around them. And young people themselves have made it clear that they want better quality RSE education because they feel it is needed. We want to ensure that we raise young people who are respectful of each other, who respect the understanding of consent, and who are able to form healthy relationships and ones that do not cause them harm and trauma. And the only way we can do that, the only way we can keep our young people safe, is to make sure that every young person has access to that information through school.
I call Chris Little.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is indeed profoundly concerning and extremely frustrating to hear that the Education Minister hasn't even responded to correspondence from the Justice Minister on RSE. I last raised this matter with the Education Minister further to the murder of Sarah Everard, and we stand here today further to another heinous act of violence against a woman in our community. Is there anything more the Department of Justice can do to activate the Minister for Education on the RSE reform that is needed to ensure a contribution to the safety of women and girls in our community?
I thank the member for his question, and of course we will continue to do what we can in terms of speaking to the wider community, but we cannot impose duties on the Department of Education. However, I would point out that the Gillen Review is not just a matter for the Department of Justice. The Gillen Review is a policy direction that has been set by the Executive as a whole, and therefore it would be expected that all ministers are participating fully in the delivery of the outcomes of the Gillen Review. And it was very clear in terms of that review that the development of quality and consistent RSE was a key component of tackling many of the issues that our society faces.
Paul Frew, you probably won't get a supplementary.
As Justice Minister, along with my executive colleagues, I continue to fully participate in discussions on the public health situation. It is not my job as Justice Minister to assess the decision-making of the Executive and report on it to this Assembly. I supported the Executive's autumn and winter contingency plan, including the most recent measures agreed by the Executive on the 22nd of December. I hope these additional measures will curtail the current rate of transmission of the Omicron variant. I want to acknowledge the dreadful impact that crimes such as rape or assault can have on victims, and I remain committed to doing all I can to support victims and to protect them from being re-traumatised. This includes legislative change as well as additional support services. In relation to the changes regarding face coverings and proof of exemption, at the time of introduction, I raised the potential impact of this change on those with hidden disabilities or sensory, anxiety or trauma-related issues with Executive colleagues to ensure their needs are considered in implementation and that any proof protects their privacy, including the reason for that exemption. The grace period for proving an exemption on medical grounds has been extended from the intended introduction on January 7th to allow further work on logistical issues involved in obtaining suitable proof of exemption, including engagement with relevant groups. This policy is still under active consideration by the Executive. The legal requirement to wear a face covering in public indoor spaces remains unchanged. Retail premises must also take reasonable measures to ensure that those in shops comply with the duty to wear a face covering. Wearing a face covering by everyone who can do so is a vital measure in preventing the spread of COVID.
And that ends the period for list of questions, members. And we now move on to 15 minutes of topical questions. And I call Paul Frew.
A twist of fate, I get my supplementary, so thank you very much. Can I ask the Minister, and I thank the Minister for her answers, and also to put on record my appreciation of her, because she raised issues, I know she raised issues at the Executive, along with my colleagues, around the matter about face masks and rape victims and domestic abuse and trauma victims. But can I ask the Minister, how can we stop and prevent mistakes like this happening in the future when it comes to these emergency regulations? And how does it sit compatible with the Executive's principles, given we've had the Gillen Review recommendations, which states that people should be believed?
Well, Mr. Speaker, again, I am not here to deliver a verdict on the decision-making processes in the Executive, and actually it would be inappropriate, I think, for me as Justice Minister to place myself as judge and jury over that process. There are a range of measures in place, and the issue at this point was the number of people who were abusing the self-certification option in terms of wearing face coverings, those who could but would not wear face coverings. The result of that was, for example, people going online, ordering sunflower lanyards, which have been hugely helpful to those who have hidden disabilities or trauma, and abusing that system for their own purposes. It was a recommendation of the Department of Health that we would make this compulsory in order that it could be enforced, because while self-certification is in place, it is incredibly difficult to foresee how such a measure can be enforced. And I have been very open about that in saying that I don't believe that racking up large numbers of FPNs should be the intention of the policy or the direction of travel. It should be to encourage and facilitate those who will wear a mask to do so, and encourage those who are reluctant to reconsider. I still believe that that is the best way forward. We were, of course, advised that it would be possible for people to receive notification of an exemption that would allow them to do so without any difficulty. Therefore, the policy was not to be enforced until the 7th of January, and that was to allow that policy to come into effect. When it became transparently clear that that was not going to be the case, I think the Executive did the right thing in terms of suspending that particular part of the policy. But I would encourage everyone who can wear a mask to wear a mask. When you do so, you are protecting yourself, and crucially, you are protecting others, particularly those who, for whatever reason, cannot wear a mask.
Supplementary, Paul Frew.
I thank the Minister for that, and I think that that will provide reassurance to many people who simply cannot wear a mask. There are many people who do not wear masks for other reasons, and they should, it is the law, but there are so many who cannot because of trauma that they have suffered. Again, I repeat the question, what can be done, Minister, to ensure that emergency legislation like this doesn't make mistakes like this in the future, an Executive of which she's part of?
Well, again, I point out that I don't think it was a mistake, Mr. Speaker. We proceeded on the basis of the information that we had, and it is right, I think, for any government, when that information changes, to be willing to reconsider its position. And that is exactly what happened with respect to the introduction on the 7th of January. This remains under active consideration by the Executive. In the meantime, it remains the law that in certain places people are expected to wear a mask. That is the law. And people ought to do so. And the Executive will work through the detail of those who are currently able to self-exempt in order to see if there is a more streamlined way in which we can provide them with the protection they need without exposing the details of their personal issues to members of the public, but also in a way that doesn't allow others who would seek to abuse the system that was already in place any further.
Andrew Muir.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The UK's Home Secretary recently announced that the UK Government's Pardons and Disregard scheme will be expanded to include any repealed or abolished civilian or military offence that was imposed on someone purely due to consensual same-sex sexual activity. Could the Minister give her assessment of this change?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that I welcome the change that has been announced, and I think it is something that is definitely an important step forward. The UK Government tabled the amendment in the Policing, Crime and Sentencing and Courts Bill to extend the scope of its pardons and disregard scheme to historical offences that regulated same-sex activity. That would enable individuals to apply to the Secretary of State to have convictions or cautions disregarded for any repealed or abolished sexual offence that either expressly regulated same-sex sexual activity or was used to regulate same-sex sexual activity. This includes any physical or affectionate activity characteristic of people involved in an intimate personal relationship. A disregarded conviction or caution will mean an automatic pardon. Those who have died prior to the amendment coming into force and within 6 months of its commencement will have a posthumous pardon. I'm fully supportive of the policy intent behind that amendment, and I also considered whether we would be able to use that bill to introduce similar change here by means of a legislative consent motion, having been advised of the UK Government's intention in late November. However, given the need to identify what offences might potentially fall within scope of an extended scheme and to make necessary adjustments to take account of Northern Ireland law, I concluded it would not have been feasible to secure legislative consent from the Executive and Justice Committee in the time available. I have instead asked my officials to undertake preparatory work on a review of our current scheme. This work will best determine what legislative changes are required to deliver the same outcome in Northern Ireland.
Honourable Muir, supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for her response. I think it sends a very clear signal that the Minister and her department are committed to ending the persecution and intolerance which occurred in the past. The LGBT community in Northern Ireland has travelled a long distance, not due to this Assembly, but despite this Assembly, and many advances have been achieved. Does the Minister agree with me that yet more achievements need to be set out and also delivered in the time ahead, so we have a truly accepting and equal society for LGBT people?
I do absolutely, Mr. Speaker, and I think at times it is to the shame of this Assembly that we have been unable to deliver things that were within our gift and instead relied on the courts or Westminster to do so. But I am absolutely committed to doing all I can to create a welcoming and diverse society, including protections for LGBTQ+ people who sadly are still the victims of hate crime today. I'm determined to make progress on the hate crime review which Judge Marinan undertook, and will be consulting on proposals in that regard very soon.
Nicole Chris-Little.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can't comprehend the evil that would take the life of such a life-giving young woman like Aisling Murphy. I can't fathom the grief that her loved ones will be experiencing at this time, and I extend the most heartfelt condolences I can to all of them. Can I ask the Justice Minister what actions are being taken and what actions can we take to eradicate such violence against women and girls in our community?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think like everyone in this chamber, I was both sickened and horrified by the murder of Aisling Murphy, and I am thinking of those who loved her at this awful time. I'm also thinking of the shockingly high number of women who have been murdered over the last 12 months in Northern Ireland, the latest being just before Christmas. It should be clear to us that urgent and radical action is required. I'm determined to do everything I can as Justice Minister, but it cannot only be for justice. We must move upstream and do the preventative work that is required to stop women becoming victims of this abuse. On Monday of last week, I was pleased to jointly launch a call for views on 2 new strategies aimed at tackling domestic and sexual abuse and violence against women and girls. My department has already taken forward an ambitious agenda of activity and new laws to protect those most at risk of violence, including a new domestic abuse offence, a stalking bill, a justice, sexual offences and trafficking victims bill, and changes to implement recommendations from the Gillen Review on serious sexual offences. While this will ensure protection for all victims, it will disproportionately benefit women and girls due to the gendered nature of many of these offences, and ensure that we are in a better place at the end of this mandate than we were at the beginning. However, Mr. Speaker, it will require a whole executive, indeed a whole society effort to ensure that we are in the position we would wish to be.
Supplementary, Chris-Little.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the response we've received from the Justice Minister. Would the Justice Minister agree that education to eradicate misogyny and unhealthy attitudes towards women and girls is another key action to eradicate this abuse and ultimately violence to which they continue to be subjected?
I do, Mr Speaker. I think that changing attitudes is a whole society response, and I think education has a huge part to play in terms of shaping attitudes, in terms of educating young people, in terms of giving young women the confidence to exercise their right to not consent to sexual activity or to report non-consensual sexual activity. And I think it is hugely important as a society that we start with our young people, that we challenge our older people, and that we continue to change the law to protect victims. But most of all, we need to stop women becoming victims. Women are vulnerable in our society not because women are vulnerable, but because there are predatory men who are out there making their lives a misery. We need to tackle the perpetrator behaviour, the culture, and the whole society change that is needed. And I believe that starting with our young people, educating them is one of the most important things we can do.
I call Daglan McAleer.
Gurmagit, and I too shared the shock and revulsion at the murder of Aisling Murphy last week, and stood in solidarity at a vigil at the Dunolly Centre in Omagh last week, where Aisling actually played as part of the Cultus Tour of Ireland in 2017. She was a very talented musician who played across Ireland and Britain. We know that the roots of these crimes is sexism and misogyny, and this is crucial to tackling violence against women. Has the Minister given any consideration or any work been carried out in making misogyny a new category of hate crime?
I thank the member for his question, and it is very timely because, as I said earlier in response to another question, I intend shortly to go to consultation. The first stage consultation on the hate crime bill, which we hope will be able to be proceeded with in the next mandate. And one of the questions on which we're seeking views in that consultation is specifically whether gender should be a protected characteristic or whether misogyny itself should be recognised as a hate crime. And so there will be an opportunity, I think, for all members of this House, but more importantly, for victims and for the wider community to have their say on that matter and feed back their views. It is a complex area of law, which is why we believe that it is important that we consult on that, along with other issues, at this early stage before we go into a more detailed consultation in the next mandate in the preparation for a bill to be brought forward to change the hate crime laws.
Supplementary, Daglan McAleer.
I thank the Minister for her response, and the Minister will appreciate that there has been a good progress made in terms of the Domestic Abuse Act, the Stalking Bill and indeed the Gillen Review. The Minister will also appreciate that confidence amongst young women in the justice system is an all-time low, and that obviously impacts on reporting of crimes and indeed conviction rates. What more does she think can be done to improve confidence in the justice system and drive these reporting and conviction numbers up?
Well, I think first and foremost, I don't accept that reporting and confidence in the justice system is at an all-time low with women and girls, because I think we have been in worse situations before, and actually the numbers of reports of crimes like this, whilst I suspect much lower than the actual prevalence of the crime, has risen, and particularly will rise in response to the work that we do in terms of communication with the public and promoting the new offences. I think it is hugely important, however, that we never rest on our laurels, because we recognise that even of those reported offences, the number that will make it to court and the number that will end in a conviction for those offences tends to be very low. There is also a high attrition rate, which is one of the reasons why in the Committal Reform Bill, which I brought through this House, I acted to abolish the need for victims to give evidence and to face cross-examination more than once in any trial, because we know that that has an impact on victims of sexual offences in particular. And also the work that we have done, for example, by providing senior sexual offences legal advisors, additional support through victim support, and also the work that we have done with remote evidence centres. But I agree with the member, there has been a lot of progress made. We continue to need to make more progress, and I think one of the things we can do as a society is make clear to young women who are subjected, whether to low-level sexual harassment or to serious sexual offending, that they should come forward, they should speak out, they will be believed, and more importantly, that the law is fit for purpose in terms of addressing it.
And members' time is up. Members, please take your ease for a moment or two. We switch the table.